many of you don't know me, I'm Liz Prendergast, and you're all very welcome. Little housekeeping, Frank has just told me that I should remind you all to turn your phones back on after this talk. So, this is our last talk until the autumn. I'm just going to give you a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. It's our last talk, and the autumn is nearly fully organised, and we start in September. The posters will be going up in August to give you all lots of notice. We'll be having Julie Parsons giving us a talk, and we'll continue to have our talks here on the second Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock. We have some great ideas for trips, and they will not be on the poster, so you have to become a member to get an email to tell you what trips we're going on. So keep an eye on your emails. On Saturday this week, the day after tomorrow, we have a walkabout in Blackrock with Frank Woods, our member here, and we'll be meeting at 11 a.m. at Mr. Magpie, which is the little gazebo as you're going into Blackrock from the Rock Road. It's on the left-hand side. There's a little park there, and you'll see the gazebo, and that's Mr. Magpie. It's kind of new. So we'll be meeting there at 11 a.m., and I'm looking forward to that walk myself.
Members only.
Members only, but, you know.
Rasher's welcome.
Everybody's welcome. So our talk today is from Neasa MacErlean, and she is a journalist. She has worked on The Observer and The Guardian in London, and for the Irish Press here, and she lived for a while in Donnybrook, and she now lives in Galway. She has written a fascinating book, I really mean this fascinating book about her grandfather who lived in Brendan Road, just around the corner from us here, and it is actually not just a book about this one man. This book is the story of a family. And like all families, there's trauma and drama and love. And the protagonist of this story, a lot of you will know, is Robert Dudley Edwards, who was a very complex and highly influential man. Not just that he influenced his family and generations of history students in UCD, but he was a tremendous influence on the way the history of this country is actually studied and taught right down to today. You may buy the book from Neasa after the talk, and without further ado, I will hand you over to her.
Thank you very much. I have to apologise slightly because one of the things that I inherited from Dudley was we're very sensitive to light. So, like, he had this green eye shade, so I'll be putting on and off my hat, so don't let that put you off too much. It's great to be back here. I've spent so many summers with them, and oh, thank you. Thanks, that's nice for me. Yeah. I'm always searching for gloomy places. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I was back here most summers with them, walking through Herbert Park. Dudley was a great walker. I'll talk about that a bit later on. And I wanted to start by saying, you remember sometimes people come up with the same idea in different parts of the world, exactly the same idea. They're working away on it without realising that someone else is working on it too. So you get calculus in. I'm looking at Elizabeth Ann Boren here because she's got some papers related to Isaac Newton, who was inventing calculus in Lincolnshire at the same time as Gottfried Leibniz was working on it in Paris. The two of them exactly on the same area in the 1670s. Or you get the jet engine being invented during the Second World War, both at the same time, but in Rostock by Hans von Ohain, and then also over in Cambridge by Frank Whittle. And then here you get history, a similar idea developing at the end of World War II, and there are 4 people in particular who were looking at how history had to change in a very, very similar way, mostly not knowing what the other ones were doing, and they did meet, most of them, not all of them, at the end. And so one was in Dublin, here, that Robert Dudley Edwards. One was in France, in Lyon. One was in Buchenwald, and I mean in the concentration camp, and the other one was in Cambridge. And I'm just going to mention these ideas and how they related to each other. So if you'll come with me now in your imagination, 1,500 kilometres away to Lyon in 1944, and that's where Marc Bloch, the social historian, was living. And he was 56 years of age, and going round in 1944, investigating archives in various parts of France, or at least that's what he said he was doing. He was doing it partly, but what it was really functioning as was a cover, because he was a member of the resistance, and it was difficult for him because he was 56 years of age, and if you're going to be a member of the resistance, you really want to be as fit and healthy as you can be, and that's quite hard at that age. He was writing a lot. His little son had said to him, "What is a historian?" And so he started to write down he was writing manuscripts on what is history. And at the same time, Robert Dudley Edwards was in Dublin, a lot younger than him. He was 35 in 1944. And on the 8th of March 1944, the nationalist newspaper in Ireland published the wonderful news for Robert Dudley Edwards, who was living in Clontarf then, that he had was going to be the next professor of modern Irish history at UCD. And this was basically the only job that Dudley really wanted, and he got it. So 8th of March 1944. And on that day, I can tell you exactly what Marc Bloch was doing on that day, 8th of March 1944. He was going through Lyon, he was crossing the bridge, and he was stopped by the Gestapo and arrested, and they suspected exactly what he had been doing, and they went back to his house, and they found all the evidence that they needed. They found the receptors, the devices, they found the notes. It was absolutely clear cut. And it was so important that they caught him, they were so pleased with it, that they messaged Berlin about this, and notification appeared about it in the newspapers. And he was taken off to, in some of the newspapers, the pro-Nazi newspapers, and he was taken off to the Gestapo headquarters in Lyon, where he was for 2 months, and where he was tortured by someone whose name was very familiar for a while, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, who would carry out some of the torturing himself. And 2 months afterwards, we had the Normandy landings, and then so a month from now, in 1944, June the 16th, Bloomsday in 1944, Marc Bloch was executed, one of 28 men who were executed by machine gun, because the Germans were having to move out. They were having these disaster plans put in place after the Normandy landings, and obviously getting rid of prisoners like that was just brutal, but useful. So that's what they did. Bloch obviously had never known Dudley, never heard of him. I told you that Marc Bloch had been writing, and fortunately his papers were safe. So it wasn't just pieces of paper that were thrown out and we never knew about them. After the war, what he'd been writing was turned into a book called The Historian's Craft, and it was taught at UCD under Robert Dudley Edwards in the department there. Because in 1953 it was published in English, and you still hear references to it, subtle references. I'm going to a conference in Leipzig, in August, and there's a section there just called the Historian's Craft. It's making this subtle reference to Marc Bloch. But Marc Bloch and Dudley had a great deal in common. What they were talking about history as perspective until around about this time, until the Second World War. The British model of history had really dominated, and the perspective was that it was a bit like God's perspective. There was one perspective, and it was the ruling elite of British history that was describing the arc of progress, an inevitable arc of progress, and that was history. You didn't have the perspective of social history, in that we all have our different perspectives, and even that an Irish perspective might count for something. It's not just the English perspective that mattered. But in those days, it was really just Macaulay and Trevelyan and the great British historians who just set down this example. You know, they were wonderful writers, so it was quite convincing that God was really Protestant, and that the British Empire was the way that was the way that history was written. So Bloch was disagreeing with that as a social historian, and he was also interested in economics, because once you start writing about social issues, then you start asking questions like about how much people earn in economics, and what creates labour movements, and how they negotiate with about pay. So one area of history enriches another, and then you get the long cycles of that perspective on history that you get through economics. We have our economists here. And she was telling me before, Geyl was telling me before the talk that you threw away your economics books after you'd done your degree. But anyway, so Dudley wasn't an economic historian himself, but he very much encouraged the study of economics, and that because of the long cycles, it not only meant that history could look back and see how often crashes are developed, industrialisation, how much you could compare it to other changes in how people earn their living. But you could also start to look forward. I mean, this is not really what historians do today, but there are branches of history that Dudley was quite interested in, which through economics, modelling backwards, could also model forwards, and he was interested in that as well. Well, what was happening was that history was becoming more relevant, and because it wasn't just this one perspective of God, or that elite perspective, and you could write about nurses, or you could write about the results of the census, or whatever. This meant all of us, we were starting to be included in history, and we were starting to feel that our documents made history too. What our parents and grandparents did, and maybe even what we do, we're going to become part of history. And Dudley became very interested in local history, because all history is local. Before, when you had a Macaulay approach to history, well, that was great history and important history, and you wouldn't necessarily expect God to appear here for the local history to develop, if you see what I mean. But Dudley encouraged history, local history, in a way that no one else had done that in Ireland. In the early 1950s, he was encouraging the establishment of local history societies all across Ireland, so that every single parish, every single inch would be covered by a history society. And he'd be absolutely delighted to see that in 2006 there was the creation of the Ballsbridge, Donnybrook and Sandymound Historical Society, and here we are today. He expanded history through UCD into all sorts of other different areas, like labour history, women's history, international relations, because history tended to be more. A lot of it was just the state that you lived in. That was the history that you wrote about. And then political science started off in history and then span off. And of course, Dudley, if there was one thing he was really famous for, it was archives, setting up the archives departments. But I'll just mention talking about like several of those areas have been written about in a book called Jubilee Theirs. So written by Elizabeth Prendergast here and read, I'm sure, by some of you. So that was kind of coming out of this changing perspective, yeah. And then your book comes out, and then we have, a bit over a decade later, 14 years later, we have the bestseller come out about Irish nurses in the National Health Service, and it just goes on and on. So why? So this was happening. Why was this happening at the end of World War II? Well, the changing perspective. But at the end of every war, and this will be relevant now to where we are now as well. You get a change in values when you get the New World Order. So at the end, so 1945, we moved to America, being the hegemon. Sorry, is that the right way to pronounce it? Yeah, okay, yeah, that's good, yeah. And so that creates different values. And many of the historians who are involved in helping historians to meet each other and to recognise those new standards that were set up were Americans at that stage. Dudley knew Eamon de Valera, and Eamon de Valera was very interested in international organisations and his own involvement in them, but he was very interested in the Comité International des Sciences Historiques, CISH, which was set up in 1926, and Dudley helped, Dudley and Theo Moody, his great partner collaborator from Trinity History Department, they got Ireland to sign up into this organisation in 1938, just in time, basically, and this changed how history was taught over here, because suddenly Ireland was accredited by the World Organisation for History, and that meant that people like it meant that UCD students who wanted to do a PhD would be accepted abroad, particularly in Cambridge. Dudley helped lots of them get to Cambridge, and also people from Cambridge would be interested in coming here. It wasn't just a country which didn't have standards. But what really broke the template for the British template for history was that because it had been seen as the arc of progress, that history was the arc of progress, you couldn't call World War II progress, because Europe was bankrupt and 53 million people were dead, and the incinerators had been found in Auschwitz, and so it was just proven, bang, like that the old way of studying history couldn't work anymore. And the third person that I want to mention in this context really knew about it. I mentioned Buchenwald. So this was Pieter Geyl, who later became Professor of Modern History at the University of Utrecht, and he spent 13 months in Buchenwald and in another concentration camp. 13 months is a very long time to survive, and he was 57. I mean, it's really quite amazing that he managed to do it. Each concentration camp is obviously very different, but in Auschwitz, the life expectancy was 3 months. Pieter Geyl had ended up in Buchenwald because he was writing about Napoleon. He wrote an essay about Napoleon, and the publisher decided not to publish it. This was in 1943. Because the publisher was nervous that you could draw comparisons between Napoleon and Hitler, that was right. The publisher was right in the publisher's intuitions, and so Pieter Geyl was arrested and taken off to Buchenwald because of that. However, like Marc Bloch, he carried on writing himself, and in Buchenwald. Was where he started. He was writing a book that was published immediately after the war was over, in 1946, and this was Napoleon for and against, and it's what it's saying is that historians writing about Napoleon didn't just write about Napoleon, but they reflected their own values of the time, whatever kind of society's values they believed in. They were putting them onto Napoleon. And that might remind you of someone, that description, because it might remind you of Herbert Butterfield's The Whig Interpretation of History. Herbert Butterfield is the fourth person, and he later became Regius Professor of History at Cambridge University. And Dudley had read The Whig Interpretation of History, written in 1931, when he was a student himself, studying for his PhD in London, and was very impressed by it, because Herbert Butterfield was one of these few British historians who didn't just write like that in the Macaulay style. He understood Irish history. He realised that Irish and British history were completely interconnected. The Gordon Riot, or the majority, or even the survival of prime ministers. It's a pretty topical discussion at the moment, but that depended very often on Charles Stewart Parnell and other Irish politicians. Dudley and Herbert Butterfield became great friends and collaborators, and they helped. In fact, Herbert Butterfield became an external examiner during the war for UCD, and this was absolutely terrific for the reputation of UCD, because it was. He was a famous historian who believed in Ireland, and what happened was that Dudley was a workaholic, and he produced a fantastic department. The Irish history became one of the great subjects of UCD, not just of UCD, but of the whole country. And what used to happen was when Cambridge was deciding whether to accept a postgraduate student, they would normally set them an exam. So someone coming from South Africa would have to pass an exam to be sure that they could reach the Cambridge standards. But this was waived in the case of UCD, because all the students were of such a high standard that there just wasn't any point putting them through a test. And but Dudley. Herbert Butterfield put into words something which I think all four of these people that I've mentioned would have said, and that's this was from the Whig interpretation of history, and that's it's just talking about bias if you only write from your own point of view. And in fact, he expressed some of these ideas when Dudley invited him in 45, again, very quick off the mark, to give a talk to historians at the Shelburne. Herbert Butterfield talked about the great time of diplomacy which had passed, saying that there weren't any more Talleyrand's, Metternichs or Castlereaghs, and what a shame that was, because those people could really understand each other and produce agreement. Again, this is rather topical, isn't it? Because there wouldn't be many people who would say that ours was a great time of diplomacy at the moment. But Butterfield was talking about the need for understanding, because what was actually happening was that in 1945, Robert Dudley Edwards and Herbert Butterfield, and probably the others too, were really worried that violence could flare up again. It wasn't just that the war came to an end. Rationing lasted such a long time, and we were in such a difficult position. In his talk at the Shelburne, when he was talking about that, he talked about the need for understanding, that was really fundamentally what history did, and he said, nothing is more needed today than the surmounting of this particular hurdle, and nothing is more futile than merely to blame the foreigner and to rail at his wickedness when somewhere or other there is involved also an intellectual incapacity of our own. And what Butterfield said, and Dudley totally agreed with him too, was the overcoming of this particular hurdle between nations is the real service that historical study might do in our time. Finally, I think another thing that all four of these historians would have had in common was either they were attacked for being revisionists, or they could have been attacked for being revisionists. I mean, Marc Bloch should have been if he'd lasted long enough. Certainly Pieter Geyl was, and clearly Butterfield should have been attacked for it if he wasn't, and Dudley certainly was. Because what they were trying to do was that they were trying to remove simple ideas of right and wrong in a way. There's Pieter Geyl really saying Napoleon wasn't just a great hero in this sense, or for this group of people. It depends on what your bias is. Very similar to what Butterfield was saying, and Dudley had done this too. He was trying not to. In taking out the heroes and the villains from history, he was trying to get people to analyse what was happening and therefore really understand it. So the second of his 7 books was The Great Famine, produced 100 years after the famine itself, and commissioned from Dudley by Eamon de Valera to take the first acts from the famine. And produce a book. And what it controversially didn't do was it didn't point the finger at the Brits. And that was very controversial, both then and later on in the revisionism debate. But what they're all trying to do, and what you can see Herbert Butterfield is doing, is don't point the finger at the foreigner and say that it's all that person's fault, because that doesn't really help you understand what the problems were. And if you look at the Great Famine, there's 7 chapters in it. One of the chapters is a medical chapter, which was quite an innovation in itself, and it was talking about the fever that followed the famine, and there isn't blaming in there whatsoever. What it does do, it talks about all the different factors that helped deal with the fever, things like how important ventilation was in hospitals, and the danger of people all coming together in the famine for food, but in COVID-19 for vaccinations. And I wonder sometimes, in fact I might look into it and research it, if the knowledge that came out of that somehow was absorbed here in this country, because we did so much better per head than Britain and the US. We had a record of what we'd done. This was the kind of analysis that really Dudley and Butterfield and people were talking about and understanding. In the last part of Dudley's mission, Dudley really was a man with a mission. If you ever saw him just walking down the road, this was a man with a mission. And the last part of his life happened here. And in 1973, he and his wife Sheila moved into 21 Brendan Road, and you'd often see Dudley walking through Herbert Park if he was going for lunch in the RDS, or you'd see him go along Morehampton Road. So I'm pointing in the wrong direction. I'm always lost wherever I am. So when he would walk down I'd walk down Morehampton Road with him sometimes, and I'm very aware, like, he was sort of even on business then, because he stood out so much. He was 6 foot tall, which is quite tall for someone born in 1909, and he was built like the rugby player he had been at school, chest out. He'd brush his white hair up, and I'd be walking along next to him, and buses would go by, and the buses would be looking at Dudley going along, because he was what you would imagine the eccentric professor looked like with this mission. When he came through Herbert Park, he wasn't quite so much on duty there, because buses didn't go by, and he wasn't sort of didn't quite have to do that bit. Because I think his portrayal as the slightly eccentric professor was very helpful to him, because you can get away with saying a lot that it would otherwise be very controversial if you're an academic and wear an academic gown. And what he was saying was controversial, as tell you in a minute, because he was anti-violence in a time when the heroes, Patrick Pearse and everyone had been men of violence, so very difficult for a history professor to get the right balance on that. So when he was here too, it was in his last few years, and he was setting up archives. He was lobbying all the way. De Valera was very interested in the academic life himself, had wanted to be a mathematics professor, and was completely on board with Dudley's aims in history and certainly with archives. And Eamon de Valera was sitting in the front row at one of Dudley's talks like this, where Dudley was saying, we must we must set up archives in this country. We don't have them. And eventually Dudley was successful. And UCD archives was set up, and Dudley was the first director of UCD archives. And then UCD archives was based in St Stephen's Green. I'll get the numbers wrong, but actually there is someone here who knows what the right number is. I think it might have been AC2 St Stephen's Green that Dudley's archives were in, because AC4 was next door, which was where Foreign Affairs was. And Dudley was talking one day in the back garden, when it was a lovely day like this, sitting out in the back, and a voice came over saying, "Dudley, I can hear you," and this was Garrett Fitzgerald, which was very handy for Dudley, because Garrett had been a student of his. Sorry to say Garrett, because I heard about it a bit like this. And so Dudley and Garrett Fitzgerald would talk over the fence about the importance of archives. And then when Garrett did become Taoiseach, he, on the second go, he very quickly introduced the bill, which became the National Archives Bill. And in 1988, that was enacted 4 days before Dudley died. So he was right to be on the mission and to be walking at a furious pace down Moorhampton Road, because there's only 4 days in it really, this lifelong mission of his. When he lived here too, he wrote the last 4 of his 7 books. He was often criticised for not having written more, but it's amazing how he managed to pack everything into his life. He was so keen to set up the proper infrastructure for history that he neglected his own reputation. He drank quite heavily actually too. He was an alcoholic, so I should mention that. I'm not trying to give you tell you that he was a saint, so he did neglect his own reputation, but he wrote the last 4 books, and one of these books was coinciding with the 200, what would have been the 200th birthday of Daniel O'Connell, and it was a biography of him. And believe it or not, this was 1975. Daniel O'Connell wasn't a popular figure in those days, and Dudley was really starting the work to rehabilitate his reputation. And Dudley was very persuasive and never gave in on a cause. And so you suddenly started having Liam Cosgrave gave a talk about what a great statesman Daniel O'Connell was, and he was rehabilitated. And now we're seeing this still with historian Taoiseach Micheál Martin celebrating, putting aside money for us to celebrate Daniel O'Connell's 250th, and we're going to be celebrating the anniversaries of Catholic emancipation, and there's been money put aside for this new chair of Irish history at Cambridge University, which is wonderful really. But Alvin Jackson is going to be the professor there, and I think he's someone who's really, like Roy Foster, going to be promoting it, you know, not just writing the books and doing the footnotes, but actually being out there and talking about it, and really probably talking about understanding and the important role of history in that way. But just to go on to, actually I just mentioned, sorry, just quickly, another quick book. Dudley was, Dudley never dated. When I was writing the book about him, he never gets boring. He's never sort of saying things that are overtaken by time. Dudley, when we'd be walking down here to go to the RDS, was very interested in China. I mean, here we are at the moment. China is taking over as the hegemon from the United States. That's basically what all this trouble's about, isn't it? And at least Xi and Trump are speaking at the moment, and but I don't know how Dudley managed to work out, I suppose, that this was going to happen, that China was a very sophisticated society with a great tradition of learning, and with its population and with its discipline, that this was going to happen. So Dudley, you were right, and he was also, he could see the impact that would happen when archives would be digitalised, and also genealogical records. And Europeanisation also. This was in one of the books that he'd just written when he moved here, but he never stopped thinking about new ideas. He was, when the revisionism attack was made, Dudley was accused. He died in '88, and then the revisionism attack happened late '88, '89, and then carried on for 15 years or something. So that was saying really that the revisionists, which would be Dudley, Moody, and many other historians, that they left the heart out of his history, and that they damaged the reputation of the great heroes, and that they had no feelings and no values. That revisionism was value free. But actually, Dudley was a very emotional person, and underneath it all, he was actually biased himself, because he was biased in favour of anti-violence. I suppose you could call that a bias. It is a bias, and that was the thing he couldn't really sort of say out loud because of the Irish espousal of violence in its fairly recent history, and. But Marc Bloch had, when he'd been writing, he'd been saying in his book, The Historian's Craft, he talks about the real importance of not blaming people, and he says, he talks about this mania for judgment, which is he uses the word that it's the satanic enemy of true history. And this was the man who actually died soon after, at the end of a machine gun. He didn't want the Nazis to be blamed in history books, because he really wanted it to be understood. And Pieter Geyl likewise didn't want that to happen, and Dudley too. Dudley really wanted his young students to live, and what he wanted to avoid was a story that a friend of mine in Dublin told me recently about a Ukrainian professor who lives here in Dublin, and she went back to Kyiv a few months ago, earlier on this year, and she went to the graveyard there, and she found 37 of her students there, and that was what, so I feel a bit emotional about that. Dudley didn't want that, because he knew that that's what could have happened with some of his students. And he talked about this in 1961 when he was on a lecture tour to the United States. People often say things, politicians say things that they're a bit unsure about sometimes on their home ground when they go abroad. And Dudley, similarly, in 1961, and he was talking about his students with compassion there, and he said this, brought up to believe in the traditional heroism of their father, many of them have been rather at a loss to see what they themselves could do to emulate such mighty figures. They have sought in vain for a lead on partition, which to so many is an unacceptable fact in the light of the nationalistic interpretation of Irish history. There is also a danger of failure having the effect of paralysing their initiative. Insecurity and failure can create pessimism. So this is what was running through the back of Dudley's mind as he was teaching people. And Moody was the same. Theo Moody, they both really hoped that if people could understand and analyse, that they wouldn't pick up arms, kill other people and kill themselves. So all four of these people, they had this similar ideas really about universal history. And so once you're seeing what Herbert Butterfield could write about Irish and English history being connected, and then Pieter Geyl was writing about other countries in Europe, and Pieter Geyl was an expert on British history as well, and was a great admirer of Macaulay's style, but nevertheless said that his essays were exclusively and intolerantly English, very angry about what had happened there. So universal history was an alternative to this, and universal history hasn't really taken off that well, because I suppose in some ways the politicians, if you look at Trump and Putin at the moment, they're both trying to control his history. Trump has as much as Trump would say fake news, he would say fake history. And he's passed one of his executive orders, which actually is having, which talks about, you know, history being something that makes people feel good about themselves and about their country. And so that's actually had the effect of the slavery museums being much less able to talk about the past, because that's not patriotic anymore. And of course, this is relevant for us now, universal history. I mean, how much do we here understand Russia's motives in Ukraine? How much do we understand Ukraine? Do we think that Israel understands Gaza? Not really. And does the US understand Iran? Well, not really. Certainly the current administration doesn't. So these four people, they also all saw education as liberation, liberation of the mind, and they were prepared to die for it. I mean, Marc Bloch did, and Pieter Geyl was lucky to escape with his life. History really took off in Ireland, as I was saying about. It was not just a flagship subject at UCD, but in the country. I mean, at the moment, the top two books in the hardback non-fiction category right now are number one, The History of Us, about the 1926 census, and the second one is The Shortest History of Ireland. I think that's very unusual. You wouldn't have a book in Britain come that high up, for instance. That's the other country that I know. I know well, if it was about a census. I mean, a census, you know, it would sound boring over there. So what I think all four of these did was, before they and people like them started to teach history and to write about it, you could really have renamed history as patriotism. After they came along, it was a subject that was worthy of the name history. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've been very privileged this evening to have this lecture, I think. I'm a little scared when you said you had nothing of interest for us. But actually, well done. You've held all our attention so well, and I think people will have questions to ask, because you've opened many, many, many doors of thought. Has anybody got questions? Yes.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations. That's a great talk, also a great book. And the book is so much more, I think, than just about the grandfather. It's a terrific take on Irish historiography and how it developed. So I must say, we had known each other for many years, going back to when I was at the embassy in London in the 90s, and you were a correspondent for the Irish Press.
That's right.
So immediately I heard you writing the book, I wanted to copy, but I just expected, a very straightforward kind of answer, which it does a lot more complex and a lot more informative. The only thing I didn't quite understand is the title. Now, telling the truth is dangerous if you're living in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or whatever. And certainly, the standards of free expression in the Ireland of Dudley's day were far from perfect. But on the other hand, you were unlikely to be dragged away and put in the dungeons of Dublin Castle for telling the truth at that time. I mean, there were societal pressures and so on, and many people were perhaps forced to emigrate for telling the truth in a way that the system didn't want it. But I just wondered about the title, if you could explain a bit about it, and in what is it just as a kind of an abstraction that telling the truth is dangerous, or do you think it was actually dangerous to Dudley personally?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do think it was dangerous to Dudley personally. It was, as you see, if Dudley and Eamon de Valera had told the truth, neither of them would have got anywhere, because they were both, we think, illegitimate, and Dudley, that would have been the end of their careers for a start. So it was dangerous, not physically in that sense, but say goodbye to your career and go and work in the fields for the rest of your life. And so Dudley had to make that decision. In fact, Dudley didn't know himself. It wasn't, his father didn't dare tell him for many years later. So his father, who was a very honest man, a Quaker, withheld this important piece of information from Dudley. But obviously, Eamon de Valera had a real suspicion and had to be very, very careful about that. Dudley's mother wanted to enrol him in the Civil War. Dudley was 13, but he looked sort of 15, 16, and he could have told a lie. This isn't quite what you're saying, but he was always very nervous afterwards, because he could see how easily mothers, and some of them did, push their children into fighting, and that was why he was sympathetic to his students. Really, I'm worried that they would try to do the brave thing. But it was Pat Harrigan here, sitting in the front row to me. We had several conversations in her kitchen about Dudley, and you know, when I was saying about Dudley was cultivating the academic with the white hair, it was safe for him to say certain things in that role. But if he'd been saying them as a politician, I don't know if he would have got away with it, especially the anti-violence. And I think Dudley got away with that a lot. But when he was writing, one of his books, on the O'Connell book, so that was written in 1975. That was written when there were 1974, there were 300 people killed in the north that year. Violence was really flaring up. Remember Pat and myself, Pat saying to me, no, you thought that that he actually could have got into trouble with the wrong people, come under been brought to their attention. In fact, afterwards, I think Sinn Féin has stopped some of the funding for some of the historical structures that Dudley set up. So although it wasn't dangerous exactly, you could start to feel a bit nervous about some of this. And Dudley was quite a nervous person, and an insomniac for his whole life, and an alcoholic. There's always reasons for these things. I think he was testing a lot of the time how far he could go.
Where did he get an excellent talk? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Where did he come from originally? Where was he born?
He was.
And where did he grow up?
He was a really proud Dubliner, and so he was born. He was born right in the centre of town. I don't even know if I mention it in the book where he was actually born. He was born in a hospital, but he lived in Dartmouth Square.
Oh, yeah.
And his father had done well and was a house there. And he then he went to live in Clontarf afterwards. But when he came back to Donnybrook afterwards, he was really glad to get back to the part of town that he felt most at home in. But he knew, he walked, because he walked a lot, and he'd been at St Enda's school just for a year in 1917, I guess, when he was 7. And they were basically they were taught, all the kids, the little boys were being taught the shortcuts, and he thought afterwards basically that if there was violence again, that they were being taught how to bring messages along. So Dudley, you go anywhere with Dudley, and he could take you down the shortcuts, prided himself on that. And he loved being a Dubliner, and he would, and he knew all the taxi drivers. He was absolutely delighted. One of the taxi drivers told him that he'd actually been born in Cleary's, I think. Somehow the taxi driver was born there, so Dudley would be talking to us about that and about the Dublin accent, Dublin sayings. And one of the things that made us bond, because I think I was a bit, because whatever the history I studied was over in Britain, and I was taught about a completely different Oliver Cromwell, for instance. I mean, I wasn't sort of at all in tune with Irish history, and but he liked the idea that I was a Cockney, because I was actually born just on the edge of qualifying to be a Cockney, and he loved the Cockney Irish lingo, like Brendan Behan did, and so he saw a connection. The Cockneys were the London Irish, which in many ways they are really, with the gift of the gab and always the cheeky response.
Can I endorse what the first questioner said? It's a wonderful book. And I studied history in UCD. Dudley was a professor. I didn't do his courses, but he was such a larger-than-life character. Everybody in UCD knew him. And it was a wonderful history department, and the people he appointed. But I think what he did with history was courageous. The so-called revisionism, to challenge all the assumptions. And it's still not popular. I mean, Sinn Féin regularly denounce historians they don't like. They believe that the old-fashioned nationalist version, we were oppressed for 800 years, and that is the only history they want to hear. And unfortunately, I think the traditional version of history, it's very hard to shake it. I think the history in schools is very good. Because of the way Dudley taught history in the university, the whole teaching profession, the popular education moved along, and history in schools is good. But so many people, despite the good history teaching in school, revert to a very simplistic, in a way, I suppose English people revert to, we were always right, and so my question really is, do you think good historians can actually really change things, or will kind of historical myths overwhelm that?
I do think historians can change things. Obviously, we're losing the battle right now. That's for sure. You can see what's happening in Poland or in Spain. I've just been looking at a couple of examples there. A bit like the slavery museums in America, not being confident enough to produce the exhibitions they would have done in the past. People like, actually Nigel Farage hasn't tried too much to tamper with the writing of history, but goodness knows what's going to happen. If we go further down that route, and I think the four historians that I was talking about, they almost became action men. They were to. They actually gave their lives, or Marc Bloch did, Pieter Geyl almost did, and Dudley's life was changed by that experience when he was 13. I think in a country such as Ireland has such an interest in Irish history that it surprises me sometimes when I do hear the vehemence. I was at a meeting the other night because I spend a lot of time in Galway, and we've got a by-election down there. I was listening to one of the candidates who was perfectly reasonable, and then started talking about neutrality, and then that got him onto the subject of colonialism, and the atmosphere changed in the room, and you were suddenly moved from being rational into your heartbeat was going up, and the temperature was rising. It was just off to a different kind of discussion, and you wonder at a moment like that, can you draw it back? I wonder, actually, if I see him again, I should speak to him about that. Not that I'll get anywhere, but it's very dangerous because it's so attractive, And if you're a 19-year-old, it can be very attractive to go and do something about it. I think the historians set the narrative for politicians.
And you have a history teacher here who has a
Yes.
question.
Just in response to your comment, as somebody involved in history and education,
Yes.
history, let me champion the teaching of history, if I may, now that I don't think you're right about the kind of reverting back to maybe what the old canon of kind of heroes and villains. And I think the evidence of this is that, well, it's very much in the news at the moment about reform of senior cycle, and we're constantly looking at the curriculum and making it relevant, etc. etc. I sit with confidence about the future of what students are actually being taught in the classrooms and at third level. And going back to Dudley, I mean, one thing that certainly when I was also in UCD and studied history there, is that you were constantly brought to sources and to evidence. That everything that you studied, you had to justify, and don't trust anything. Be skeptical, about everything. And that's happening in the classrooms now, believe it or not. And it's very much reflected in the curriculum, where, you know, even at junior level, you know, where students are taught to interrogate sources and to be given different perspectives. And, you know, you emphasise that very much, Neasa, about, you know, not just taking the one, as I say, one particular narrative. So it's becoming, thankfully, the language of how students are being taught and how they are looking at history to, as I say, see a particular course of events from different perspectives, and that can only be a good thing in terms of the skills that they're learning as future citizens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Deirdre, and it is so true with social media out there. It's the analysis of what you're being fed is so important.
Just a short question. Thank you for a lovely, wonderful talk. Did Dudley have any interest in Newman?
I don't particularly remember him talking about that myself. No, why do you ask in particular?
Well, I mean, the idea of university and Newman's idea also of the old Oxford system of tutorials. And I confess I studied economics, and the history department was to the fore in having tutorial systems and that interaction, and we followed then in economics shortly afterwards. But that was, I just wondered if he obviously didn't, if you didn't know.
Well, he that came from Desmond Williams studying in Cambridge, and then Kevin B. Nolan, and then them coming back and saying there's this wonderful system. So it was them really setting it up, and Dudley being very open to or new ways of teaching, because he really wanted to interest people. You know, it had been acceptable to teach any old subject in a very boring way, and you just repeated it and maybe disciplined children in school, but he wanted people really to be engaged and to love it, and he introduced amazingly this examination method that people absolutely love. Pat Harrigan went through the famous marathon exam, where it's a bit like what you're saying, Deirdre, in some senses, because all the students, 8 students in a class would all be given different essays to write. So we might be talking about how do you see the world. 1st of January 1939, you're Hitler, you're Mussolini. The roles would be given out like that. Then you'd read out your papers, and then you'd cross-examine each other over several days and produce the evidence. And so people loved that experience. And when I was writing the book 60 years after they'd been through it, people were saying how it made them come alive and see history in a different way. Dudley was always battling, though. I mean, within a Catholic university, he was battling against. I think one of the first non-Catholic lecturers came through into history, and they were doing horse trading with the powers that be, so that they could get a non-Catholic in.
Newman employed some of the young Irelanders, and Dudley probably wouldn't have approved. But I mean, there's a big break between the Catholic University, Newman, the Jesuits, and then UCD was set up in 1908 under the Universities Act.
Yeah.
And Galway and Cork the same. So it's not really a connection. But I thought, because of the tutorial system, because Newman's idea of university was based on his own experience in Oxford and Oriel College and Trinity and so on, that might have sparked some ideas with Dudley, but if not.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if when he was justifying it, because there would have been an expense there, that would be the sort of argument that he would produce to justify the cost, or He was very grateful to the religious orders for what they'd done in education in this country, because he was making the comparison, I think, in his lectures in the US, with what had happened to other former colonies, I mean the African countries, who still had problems with literacy because they hadn't had the institutions set up by the religious orders that then flourished and educated the whole country in the same way that we did.
Thank you.
Do you think Catholicism in UCD, created a bias in departments. I mean, I studied there in 2012. I didn't study history, I studied science for 4 years, and I found that it still existed within departments. Its influence, do you think it could have led up to a bias in certain academics?
Oh, I think it definitely did. That was what Dudley was up against when he was there, appointed. What was it? 1944, 45. He took up the post. I mean, there were 5 departments that were absolutely being controlled by Archbishop Quaid's men. Absolutely, the appointments. Because if you can control the appointments, well, you're laughing then in the propaganda that you can produce. But yeah, there was a lot of it, and it took a long time to die down. But one of the things I was interested in that I mentioned in the book is Dudley was interested in Marxist history, and our economics in the room know how much Marx affected the study of economics, and to leave Marx out even of history was a great shame. And Dudley was going to discussions about Marxist history in London when he was free to do that, but he couldn't bring it back into UCD. It was only even in 1980 it was difficult. I mean, there was some teaching of Marxist economics.
Lynch was professor.
Right.
He was quite, I think he was quite friendly with Dudley.
He was.
And he would have, had an interesting view on Marx and
Well, like I just said, in the 70s, I did some course on Marx, and whether it was in history or political science, I can't remember. So by the 70s, there might have been resistance, but it was there to taught.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, and what was did he do anything on military history or on Gaelic history as such, the Irish language?
Oh, but both of them. He on Gaelic history. His accent wasn't very good, but he could speak and read Irish, and he was a Tudor historian himself. So he was going back and read with the documents. Obviously, were in Latin. So he was a much better linguist than you might have realised. I know over in Galway that they were thinking that he had very little interest in the Gaelic history, but he wrote that's not true at all. It's just you had to specialise in something, and he was special. His area was particularly Tudor. On the military side, he was trying to set up a chair of military history at UCD right after the war, because it was so important to understand what created wars. But that was delayed. It didn't happen until.
Could I just add as a footnote that Dudley would turn up. The common ground is essentially debating society, not the other thing.
Yeah.
And most years Dudley would be invited to come along and chair a meeting, which he was quite capable of doing. It would be somewhat lubricated before he came to the meeting, which was considered to add to the legacy. But it was a perfectly okay meeting.
Oh, great. Yeah.
The other thing I would like to say is that we complain that Britain, England, the United Kingdom, whatever, neglects Irish history. I found one of the interesting things was his recognition that we in Ireland neglect English-British history, and the reforms, some of the reforms which were carried out in Ireland, like the Land Acts, for instance, and conditions of industrial employment, were very often much better in Ireland than they were in Britain, and the unfortunate British population had to suffer their own government, where we were suffering a foreign government, but both were suffering.
Well, he was brave enough in some of his books actually to make some of these points, and these wouldn't have made him at all more popular over here. The easy thing would have been to have not to mention those developments, which took place particularly in education, I think, as well.
It's almost closely time.
Yes, closing. Yes.
It is. My message from Newman, of course, was his promotion of the liberal education. I don't think that was really mentioned, and
UCD, I know when I applied there many decades ago, I was asked to state my religion on the application form to the university, and I don't know if that still applies even in other universities in this great country of ours. But I'm a non-historian. I came into history sideways through local history and family history, but in my mature period of life I'm really fascinated by history and bias and that sort of thing. But of course history is only as good as the sources that moving away from bias, that the actual researchers use and can get access to. Obviously oral history now is maybe perhaps a modern movement and is dependent on a different type of source, the recorder and the people that the historian is interviewing. But just to come back to Dudley and his great
we
work.
have to move on because
Dudley, I will finish my question, if I may please.
Yeah.
I waited patiently, and
Yes,
I
yes,
asked
we
you
were,
earlier,
yes,
Liz, I raised my hand and you saw me, with respect. So effectively, I was interested to hear that Dudley had a great influence on the setting up of the Archives Department at UCD. But it has to be remembered that the library school in UCD was established in 1922 and is the second oldest library school in the British Isles, if I can use that phrase, after London University. So basically when Dudley first came to UCD, he would have had access to the library and the library then perhaps would have been, I don't know where the archives were, and perhaps that's a very interesting thing to study. Where were all the archives in Trinity and in other places, and how actually were the university archivists giving access? Were they holding back? That would be very interesting. But of course they did have access to primary sources in the library context, because when a commentator writes a book in the middle of a particular era about that era, that is a primary source.
Yeah.
So Dudley, of course, and other historians would have had access to primary sources even prior to getting access to the more manuscript type of archives. But I just wonder, was he ever talking about the librarians? I am one, and did any of them?
Yes.
Is that mentioned in your book? Or?
Oh, it's not really mentioned in my book, but he knew, I can't remember the name of the lady who was the chief librarian at UCD.
What's her nickname?
She was quite a character, and he knew her very well. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, he knew her. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Power. Yeah. He knew her pretty well, and got to know her quite well, and that they were collaborators. Yeah, and there was quite a lot to work with. Dudley wasn't just inventing something from scratch, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So that was
Thank you.
really very, very good.